Page 49. But where are Sabati and German and Sosma? Who was it who thought of living below the Arctic Circle, where cattle can't be bred, and fish can't be caught, and bread grains and vegetables don't grow? Oh, you experts at ruining flourishing lands so soon, in 1 year or two, to reduce the model agricultural enterprise of the monks to total and irreversible decline. How was it done? Did they plunder it and send away the plunderer, or did they destroy it all right there on the spot? And to be incapable of extracting anything from the earth while possessing thousands of unoccupied hands. Only the free people there had milk, sour cream, and fresh meat. Yes, and the excellent cabbage of Father Methodius. And for prisoners, there was rotten cod, salted or dried, a thin gruel with pearl, barley, or millet grits, and without potatoes. And there was never either cabbage soup or borscht. And as a result, there was scurvy, and even the office workers' companies all had boils. And as for those on general work, their situation can be imagined. Prisoner transports returned on all fours from the distant work parties. They actually crawled from the wharfs on hands and knees. The prisoners were allowed to use up 9 rubles a month out of money orders from home, and there was a prison commissary in the chapel of German. This image. And 1 parcel a month could be received, which was opened and inspected in the ISCH, and if you didn't bribe them, they would announce that much of what had been sent to you was prohibited. Grits, for example. In the Nikolskaya Church and the Uspensky Cathedral, the bunks rose 4 tiers high. Nor was the 13th Company any less crowded in the block attached to the Preobrazhensky Cathedral. Imagine the crowded mass of prisoners at the entrance, 3,500 stampeding back to quarters on returning from work. It took an hour's wait in line to get a hot water at the boilers. On Saturdays, the evening roll calls dragged out till very, very late at night. Like the former religious services. They were very particular about hygiene, of course. Prisoners were forced to have heads shaved, heads clipped, and beards shaved off. Also, all priests, one after another. In addition, they cut all the flaps off long clothing, particularly cassocks, of course, for they were a principal point of infection. The Czechists had greatcoats, which reached down to the ground. True, in the winter, the ill and aged sitting in their underwear and sacks could not make it to the baths from the company bunks. They were done in by the lice. They hid the corpses under bunks so as to get extra rations. Even though that was not very advantageous for the living, the lice crawled from the cold corpses onto the warm living survivors. In the Kremlin, there was a bad medical section with a bad hospital, and in the remoter parts of Solovki, there was no medicine at all. The sole exception was the Golgotha Crucifixion Monastery on Anzer, a penalty work party where they cured patients by murdering them. There in the Golgotha church, prisoners lay dying from lack of food and from cruelty. Enfeebled priests next to syphilitics, and aged invalids next to young thieves, and a request of the dying, and in order to ease his own problem, the Golgotha doctor gave terminal case strychnine, and in the winter, bearded corpses in their underwear were kept in the church for a long time. They were put in the vestibule, stacked standing up, since that way they took up less space, and when they carried them out, they gave them a shove and let them roll down Golgotha Hill. At one time in 1928, a typhus epidemic broke out in Kem, Bolshoi Solovetsky Island as well, and hundreds of typhus patients lay about in the unheated theatrical hall all at the same time, and hundreds likewise left for the cemetery. So as not to confuse the count, the work assigners wrote the last names of every prisoner on his wrist, and some of those who recovered switched terms with shorter-term cadavers by writing the corpses' names on their own hands. And when many thousands of the Central Asian Basmaki rebels were herded in 1929, they brought with them an epidemic characterized by black spots on the body, and all who fell ill died. It could not, of course, be that those two diseases had already been totally wiped out in the Soviet Republic, and so they called the illness Asiatic typhus. They didn't know how to cure it, and here is how they got rid of it. If one prisoner in a cell caught it, they just locked the cell and let not one out, and passed them food only through the door till they all died. What a scientific discovery it would be for us to establish that in Solovki, the archipelago had not yet arrived at an understanding of itself, that the child had not yet guessed its own character, and then to observe how this character gradually manifested itself. Alas, it didn't work out that way, even though there was no one to learn from, even though there was no one from whom to take an example, and even though it would seem that there was no hereditary element, nonetheless the archipelago swiftly discovered and manifested its future character. So much future experience had already been discovered at Solovki. The phrase to extricate from general work had already come into existence. All slept on board bunks, but there were nevertheless some who had individual cots. There were whole companies in the church, but some prisoners were crowded 20 to a room, and there were other rooms with only 4 or 5. There were already some who knew their rights to inspect the women's prisoner transports and pick out a woman. There were only 150 to 200 women for thousands of men, but later on there were more. A struggle for the soft, cushy spots through bootlicking and betrayal was already going on. They had already removed all the counter-revolutionaries from office positions, to which they were then restored because the habitual criminals only messed everything up. The camp air was already thick with continual ominous rumors. The supreme law of conduct had already become trust no one, and this squeezed and froze out the spiritual grace of the Silver Age. The free persons, too, had begun to enter the sweetness of camp life and taste its joys. Free families received the right to have the free services of cooks from the camp. They could always demand the services of woodcutters, laundresses, seamstresses, and barbers. Eichmann built himself an Arctic villa. Potemkin, too, a former sergeant major of the dragoons, subsequently a communist, a Czechist, and the chief of Transit Camp, lived lavishly. He opened a restaurant in Kem. His orchestra was recruited from conservatory musicians, His waitress wore silk dresses. GULag comrades who arrived from Russian Moscow could feast and frolic in luxury here at the beginning of the 30s. They were served at table by Princess Ch2, and their check was only a formality amounting to something like 30 kopecks, the rest being at the camp's expense. Yes, and the Solovetsky Kremlin. This was not the whole. This was not the whole Solovki. It was the most privileged place in camp. The real Solovki was not even in the monastery, where, after the socialists were sent away, work parties were established. The real Solovki was in the logging operations at the remote work site. But it is precisely those distant backwoods that are most difficult to learn about nowadays, because those people did not survive. It is known that even at that time they did not allow the workers to dry themselves out in the autumn, that in winter they did not provide them with clothes or footgear in the deep snow, and that the length of a workday was determined by the work norm. The workday was completed when the work norm had been executed, and if it wasn't, there was no return to shelter until it was. And that time, too, they discovered the device of new work parties, who consisted of sending several hundred people to totally unprepared and uninhabited places. But it would seem that in the first years of Solovki, both slave driving the workers and allotting back-breaking work norms took the form of periodic outbursts, transitory anger, and they had not become a vice-like system. The economy of the whole country was based on them, and the 5-year plans had not been instituted. In the first years of Solon, there was evidently no firm external economic plan. Yes, and for that matter, there was no very careful calculation of how many mandates went into work for the camp as a whole. This is why they could suddenly switch with such frivolity the meaningful productive work to punishment, pouring water from one ice hole to another, dragging logs from one place to another and back. There was cruelty in this, yes, but there was also a patriarchal attitude. When slave driving became a thought-out system, pouring water over a prisoner in sub-zero temperatures, or putting a prisoner out on a stump to be devoured by mosquitoes, had turned into a superfluity and a useless expenditure of the executioner's energy. There is an official figure up to 1929 in the RSFSR, the Russian Republic of the Soviet Union. Only 34 to 41% of all prisoners were engaged in work. And how could it have been any different, in view of the fact that there was unemployment in the country at the time? It is not clear whether work at servicing and maintaining the camp itself was included in this, or whether it was only external work. At any rate, work at servicing and maintaining the camp itself would not have been enough to occupy all the remaining 60 to 65% of the camp prisoners. This proportion found its expression at Solovki as well. Clearly, throughout the 20s, there were no few prisoners without permanent work, partly because of the lack of anything to wear outdoors, or else performing purely formal duties. That year of the first 5-year plan, which shook up the entire country, shook up Solovki as well. The new chief of Solon, appointed in 1930, Nogtev, the same chief of Savatevsky Monastery who had shot down the socialists, reported to the accompaniment of a whisper of astonishment in an astounded hall. To the free inhabitants of the city of Chem, these figures, not counting its logging operations for its own use, which had grown at quite exceptional tempos, Uslan had filled external orders alone for the Railroad Timber Trust and the Karelian Timber Trust. In 1926, 63,000 rubles in 2.355 million rubles, 37 times greater, and in 1930 the total had jumped another 3 times. Road construction for the Karelian Murmansk region had been carried out in 1926 in the amount of 105,000 rubles, and in 1930 6 million, increased by 57 times. And that is how the once remote Solovki, where they didn't know how to make full use of the prisoners, came to an end. A miracle worker rushed in to assist. Solovki was created via Chem Transit Camp and via Chem Transit Camp Solovki, in its maturity, began at the end of the 20s to spread back to the mainland. And the worst thing that could now befall a prisoner was to be sent out on these work parties on the mainland. Previously, the sole mainland points belonging to Solovki were Soroka and Sumsky Posad, coastal appurtenances of the monasteries. But now the advancing Slan forgot its monastery boundaries. From Chem through the swamps to the west to Ukhta, the prisoners began to build a dirt road, which had at one time been considered almost impossible to build. In the summer they drowned, and in the winter they froze. They feared this road to the point of panic, and for a long time the threat echoed and re-echoed over the Kremlin courtyard. What, you're asking for Ukhta? The second similar road was from Medvedezh, Yogorsk to Pandovsky. On its route, the Chekist Gashitsa ordered explosives set into a cliff and then sent KR counter-revolutionaries up on the cliff through his binoculars, watched them being blown up. They say that in December 1928, on the Krasnaya Gorka in Karelia, the prisoners were left to spend the night in the woods as punishment for failure to fulfill the assigned norm of work, and 150 men froze to death there. This was the standard Solovetsky trick. Hard to doubt the story. There is somewhat greater difficulty in believing another story, that is, that in February 1929, on the Chem-Ukhta road near the tiny settlement of Kut, a company consisting of approximately 100 prisoners was driven into the bonfire for failure to fulfill the work norm and burned alive. I was told this story by one solitary person only, who had been close by, Professor D.P. Kalistov, an old Solovki veteran who died recently, but I was never able to collect any corroborative testimony, and maybe no one ever will collect any, and there is also much else about it which no one is ever going to collect. Testimony about which, even one single solitary report. But after all, why shouldn't people who freeze other people to death and who blow them up in an explosion burn them alive? Because the technology involved was no more complex. Let those who prefer to put their faith in the printed word rather than living people read about the road building. By this time, by this very same Uslan, and by the very same sects, in the very same year, except that the area was in the Kola Peninsula. With great difficulty, we built the dirt road along the valley of the Belaya River, along the shore of Lake Futyarv to Kukits Fuchor, near the present Abatidi, for a distance of 17 miles, paved a swamp. And what would you think it was paved with? The answer fairly leaps to the tip of the tongue, doesn't it? But it can't be set down on paper, with logs and sand embankments leveling the capricious configuration of the crumbling slopes of the stony mountains, and then Uslan built a railroad there in addition, 70 miles in a single winter month. And why in 1 month? And why couldn't it have been postponed till summer? The task seemed insuperable. 400,000 cubic yards of excavations north of the Arctic Circle in the middle of winter, and they called it earth. It was harder than any granite, performed solely by hand, with pick, crowbar, and spade. And did they at least have mittens? The work was delayed by the need for a multitude of bridges. Work went on for 24 hours a day in 3 shifts, and the Arctic night was sliced by the light of an incandescent kerosene lanterns, as clearings were cut through the pine woods and stumps were dug out. In the midst of snowstorms which covered the roadbed deeper than the height of a man. Now go back and read that over. The work was delayed by much needed for a multitude of bridges. Work went on for 24 hours a day in 3 shifts, and the Arctic night was lighted by the light of incandescent kerosene lanterns, as clearings were cut through the pine woods and stumps were dug out in the midst of snowstorms which covered the roadbed deeper than the height of a man. You close your eyes and picture the scene. You're a helpless city dweller, a person who sighs and pines like character in Chekhov. And there you are, in that icy hell, or you are Turkmenian, and your embroidered skull cap, your Tukbi-tika, out there in that night blizzard, digging out stumps. That was in the best and brightest 20s, before any personality cult, when the white, yellow, and black and brown races of the earth looked up to our country as a torchbearer of freedom. This was during the same years when they used to sing amusing ditties about Solovki from the nation's vaudeville stages. And so, imperceptibly, via work parties, the former concept of the special purpose camp, totally isolated on its islands, dissolved, and the archipelago, born and come to maturity on Solovki, began its malignant advance through the nation. A problem arose. The territory of this country had to be spread out in front of the archipelago, but without allowing the archipelago to conquer it, to distract it, to take it over, or assimilate it to itself. Every little island and every little hillock on the archipelago had to be encircled by a hostile, stormy Soviet seascape, but it was permissible for the two worlds to interlock in a separate strata, but not to intermingle. And this Noktev report, which evoked a whisper of astonishment, was after all articulated so as to initiate a resolution by the workers of camp, which would then appear in the newspaper and be posted in the villages. Quote, the intensifying class struggle inside the USSR and the danger of war, which is increasing as never before, require the organs of the OGPU and the USLAM even greater solidarity with the workers, vigilance by organizations of public opinion. A struggle is to be waged against free prisoners rubbing elbows with prisoners, against concealment of escapees, against purchase of stolen and government property from prisoners, and against all kinds of malicious rumors which were being disseminated by class enemies about USLAM. And just what were those malicious rumors? That people were imprisoned in camp and without cause? And one more point. It is the duty of every person to inform. Disgusting free people. They were making friends with sex. They were concealing escapees. This was a terrible danger. If the country would be a goner, and the revolution would be a goner. And therefore, to combat the malicious rumors, honest, progressive rumors were spread that the camps were populated by murderers and rapists, that every escapee was a dangerous bandit. Lock your doors, be frightened, save your children, catch them, turn them in, help the work of the OGPU, and if you knew of someone who did not help thus, inform.